Hello, my name is David Minch. I'm a cybersecurity engineer. I'm here to talk about personal disaster recovery planning, or why you need to watch out for that bus. So, fortunately, you've already made it this far in the week. That's good. You have a couple more days of DEF CON to get through. So maybe this is going to be more relevant to you depending on what you end up doing at DEF CON. So let's get started. So what we're going to cover is why this even matters. We're going to talk about what makes up your digital life, which is more the focus of this talk. We're going to see how I messed this up, and we're going to laugh at it because that's the best way to learn from it. And then we're going to build your plan and test it. Because while we're hoping that everything goes well, it's DEF CON, it's life, you never really know what's going to happen, and you need to be prepared for the worst. So where does this talk even get its name from? For those not familiar, the bus count is something we use in software circles or IT circles or really any industry. And it's how many people can get hit by a bus before you run into big problems. Hopefully, there's more. It's not just you that gets by the bus and then everything's doomed and gloom. We want to have our bus count higher than 1. So that's where this talk comes from and why you need to be worried about the bus. Now, to get into the right mindset for this talk, I want you to look at this lovely starry sky with a silhouette, or you can close your eyes and hum to yourself a little bit. And I want you to think about who else in this planet is important to you? Is it yourself? That's okay. A little vain, but that's fine. Is it a spouse, a significant other, kids, parents, grandparents, or just a good group of friends? There's other people we care about that we need to plan for. So keeping these people in your mind is really important for this talk because it's really the whole reason we're here. Now, you have some cards. We're going to do some questions. This is in the spirit of BSides Las Vegas. We want some community participation. I didn't want anyone to have to come up on stage or raise hands, so we're going to use the neon index cards. I'm going to give you kind of an easier question. So the first question, will you die? There are 3 answers to this. I want you to hold up the corresponding color and look around the room because your answer is great for you, but you want to see what other people are answering. All right, I'm really surprised that there's no smart Alex in the room. But we have a lot of pink cards. Oh, we got one. Good. But the thing is that this question, while it's an easy question, is an important question because everyone is going to die. That's something we all share. It's something that is inevitable. The question is when. And the thing is the further you think you are from death itself, that actually makes it more difficult for 2 reasons. One, it means you're probably less prepared for it because it's so far away. So disaster strikes, you're going to have more problems. And 2, let's say you live a long, healthy life, which I certainly hope for all of you. But that means in the coming decades, as we get more and more digital, things are going to become more complicated, and this issue is going to be more relevant than ever. So that's a problem. All right, question 2. You're able to hold up multiple cards for this one. It's what of these types of bad things have happened to you? So take a look. Hold up the cards. Maybe you're not holding up any cards. Great for you. But the point of this question is not about what cards you're holding up. It's about the cards that everyone else is holding up around you. And if you're holding no cards, this is even more important because it's really easy in this entire topic to say this won't happen to me. But the reality is that there's people in this room that's happened to. They're good people. They're all your friends at BSides Las Vegas. But stuff happens, and we need to be prepared for it. So just because you're not holding up a card doesn't mean you're bulletproof. And for the rest of this talk, you're dead. You just, closing ceremony happens, you have another, maybe you have another drink, you're having a really in-depth discussion, and you're crossing Las Vegas Boulevard, you didn't look both ways, and you get hit by a bus. You're dead. Not very good for you. Now, the person you were thinking of when we had that lovely starry sky, are they able to keep living their life? Are they locked out of your life forever? Maybe you have preparations, but they're really not going to work when you need them to. And what's important to consider is when you're thinking of those people, where do they fall on the spectrum of technological competency? If you're lucky, you've had fierce discussions about Vim versus Emacs at 4 in the morning. We're not going to go into which one's better, but the reality is that a lot of the people you're talking about or thinking about, they're not on the right side of the spectrum. And that's okay. We still love them, maybe less, but we still love them. So maybe you're dealing with people that are in the center that, they can use a computer, but they really don't know. They're not, attending BSides Las Vegas. They don't have the full spectrum of technological competency that maybe you do. Or you have to deal with people that are on the left-hand side of the spectrum, where watching them use a computer is extremely painful to you, and somehow their Facebook status is just their Google searches, and you just don't really understand how that happens. But we have to deal with that. So, surprise question. The people you were thinking of, where do they fall on the spectrum? So I don't even see any greens. Oh, maybe we have a green over there, but most of us aren't dealing with greens. We're dealing with the yellows, the oranges, and the pinks. So it's important to think about that, because the further left on the spectrum we get, what happens if you're no longer around, and this is what they're presented with. Everything they possibly need is on the desktop, unencrypted. It's a full guide to take over everything, but they don't know what the password is for your computer. Now, the people on the right side of the spectrum are saying, okay, I would rip out the hard drive and put it in a drive caddy, and I'll just read off all the files, or let's have some fun with it. We'll just pull the Windows hashes and crack them, or we'll just swap out the hashes. I mean, we can come up with a million ways to get into it, but that's not really fair, because that's the right side of the spectrum. If you're dealing with the people that are in the middle, or the less technically competent, the whole thing stops here. That's it. Doesn't matter if you had this computer backed up. They don't know how to get to that. They don't know how to get into this computer. It's a bunch of junk right now. So we also have to think about is we've been really focused about you. You're so important. We're all being really vain, and that's okay because I directed you to do so. But there's actually a flip side of this coin. And what happens if you were walking a little bit slower, but now they're dead and the bus hit them instead? So are you prepared to be the one that's still alive to pick up the pieces for the people that you care about? Now, this has been really grim, and there's a whole lot of buses hitting a whole lot of people. Let's think about the other bad things. So, natural disasters. They're happening more frequently. I'm from Maryland. There's a cute little town. For 100 years, didn't really have flooding issues, no problem. Now, every other year, the entire first story gets destroyed by floods, and it's just like a thing you have to deal with. Ellicott City. It's a cute town, lovely Main Street, half the time underwater. You also might deal with illness or dementia. This one's really emotionally draining because the people are still there, but they're not necessarily still there, and so that's really hard to work with. You might have theft. Maybe the government comes for you. Maybe you're not so clean-cut and you did something wrong and now you're in jail. That's very unfortunate. But just because you're behind bars doesn't mean your family should have to struggle. Maybe you're in the military. You do a deployment, 6 months, a year, 2 years, with minimal communication. You want to make sure your family still is able to live their lives and without you, and not have to worry about you being gone. They're going to be very sad, but they don't have to struggle. And then you have the traditional things that you might think of that trigger bad scenario, like hardware, software failure, and those types of things. So next question. Do you currently back up your files? There's a variety of answers to this one. The pink people, the best ones, have the automatic offsite backups. Hurrah! If you have the orange ones, you have automatic local backups. That's good, but there's some problems with that because the thing that makes you need the backups might take out those as well. Or you're in my favorite category, the yellow people that say, oh, I copy everything to like this flash drive. I do it every month, but the last time you did it was 2015, and you don't know where the flash drive even is. So you're just kidding everyone, including yourself. Or you're just going to be honest, and you live on the edge, but at least you live in reality, and you just don't do backups. So hold up those green cards proudly. And then, have you lost data before? The worst is when it's completely irrecoverable, and you're pretty upset about it. Or it's no big deal, or you're just lucky and awesome. So again, the card that you're holding up isn't necessarily the one that you should be interested in. It's seeing what other people are holding up as well. So hold up this one more time. So we got some pinks. They weren't happy. All right, that's enough of the cards right now. So the question is, we've established that you might die, or other people might die, or maybe some flooding occurs and bad things can happen, and people have lost data, and it can happen to real people like the fine people in this room. But the real question is, can you recover? And can the people you're thinking about recover? And not only do you have the right controls in place, but when you need them to work, will they? That's a separate question. Just because you have something in place doesn't mean it's actually going to work when you want it to. Now, what really actually made me think about this talk in the first place was less about disaster recovery and more about locking my own self out of all my accounts. So I really like the idea of like multifactor and two-factor and encryption and all the good things that we as security professionals and security-minded people like to add onto our accounts, usually above and beyond what the regular normal people are doing. And that's great, except for I was getting increasingly worried that I was going to lock myself out of everything I cared about and really just had myself to blame. And I was also worried about, so my special someone that I'm thinking about for this talk is my wife. And I'm thinking about, okay, maybe I have all this great encryption, but that's not maybe going to go so well if she needs to get into it when I'm not around. Does she know how to decrypt it? Does she know what the decryption keys are? Does she even know that I encrypt things in the first place? Can she find the things I have in the first place? These are all issues, and while she's a technical user, it still is difficult. So let's take a step back. We've been talking a lot about disaster recovery and bad things happening and all the scary stuff, but let's talk about what your digital life is to establish some of the things you care about. So the first thing is your email account. And besides the fact that you're probably getting a lot of like coupons and spam in your email, it actually is really important because it is a common centralized repository for your digital life. When my grandparents passed away a few years ago, the way my dad found out about things that he just didn't know about was he watched their mailbox. So every couple of days, you check their mail, you get the bank statements of an account that they've never told you about ever, for some money you just didn't know existed, and you can take care of that, take care of bills, and all those sorts of things. But I don't get bills in the mail anymore. My things come to my email. And so your email account is important as a centralization of your digital life. You also have things like your social media accounts. Depending on how social you are and what actually happens in a disaster, this may or may not be that important, but it is useful. Let's say you truly are hit by a bus and you are no longer around. It is nice for your family to put those accounts to bed. Now, Bitcoin. Now, this really isn't Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. While it's very buzzy right now and everyone's made a ton of money, I'm sure. The point of Bitcoin for this talk, whenever I say cryptocurrency, is not about the here and now 2018 cryptocurrency. It's the fact that cryptocurrency is really inherently purely digital asset. And in 2018, maybe it's the only great example we can think of, but I think in 2020, 2030, 2050, and beyond, we're going to start seeing more and more purely digital innovations that just don't have an analog that we can just go to a brick and mortar store and be like, yes, here's a death certificate, give me the cryptocurrency. Private keys just really don't care about a death certificate. You have to have the right resources to get into it. And so that's what cryptocurrency in this context means. You also have your house, which right now is probably not that digital. Maybe you have a smart lock or something like that, but this is also future thinking. Every time you add a new digital device, how does that affect what happens if you're gone? At some point in 2030, we're going to have houses that if you're no longer around aren't usable until you can get into those accounts. And then you come to the more traditional things when we think about bad things happening and doing backups, is photos and your files. So, photos and videos are particularly irrecoverable because it's just your memory. So if it's gone, it's gone. You can't recreate those happy memories. But there are also important things like your documents that you may have put a lot of time into. Maybe you do a lot of business stuff at home. These are all things we want to protect. And then you have a cell phone. Well, really, a lot of times your cell phone doesn't have anything that unique that can't be replaced. It's in the cloud, everything's synchronized, that's great. But your cell phone's actually interesting because it's the extension of your digital identity, namely your cell phone number. And this has been particularly relevant in the past 2 weeks because of SMS two-factor and number porting and all these attacks on your phone number because people are realizing, oh, well, I can just steal your phone number for a little bit and I've actually assumed part of your digital identity. So let's say you're crossing the street, you get hit by that nasty bus, and you were texting, ooh, we weren't supposed to do that. And your phone's crushed too. Well, maybe now when you're thinking about recovery, gaining access to your digital identity of your phone number is actually a part of the recovery process. And so that's something to think about as well, and as part of your digital life. So I'm thinking about my digital life and what I value. And I'm thinking about all the security controls I've put on my accounts. And I'm thinking about my wife. And I want to make sure that she's covered in the case that I get hit by a bus. And so really all I have to do is I'm going to create my own disaster recovery plan. I'm going to test it. So while I was thinking more about making sure I was doing a good job documenting everything, because I thought the harder part would be just making sure my wife was able to follow everything I had done. The reality is that my plan actually didn't work in the first place. And that was really surprising to me because I was worried about security controls, but I still thought like some stuff would work. And I thought all my backups, automated offsite backups would be good enough. And it didn't work out. So what happened? So for me, I have encrypted file vault. It's just additional security control, so that way my files just aren't all over my computer. There is a centralized extra layer of encryption. Awesome. So if I can get that file vault starting from scratch, then I know I'm good. So how do we get to that encrypted file vault? So for me, I have to access my password manager. I use 1Password. We then need to access my offsite automated cloud backups. I'm using Backblaze. And then because I don't trust Backblaze as much as I could, I use private key escrow, and so they don't have the keys to decrypt the backups. I have them. And so once I decrypt that, I can get all my files. Hooray, everything's done, and I now have my disaster plan has worked. Hurrah. Except for that's not what happened. Where would I keep my important encryption keys? They would be in my encrypted file vault, because that's where I keep the important stuff. Hooray! So all my files are gone for forever. Every picture I've ever taken is gone, and I am stuck. That's not very good. Yes, sir? So that is a possibility, except for my house burned down. That's why you have a fireproof safe. Fireproof safe. Well, so it depends. It depends on how much you're willing to invest in a fireproof safe. The cheap ones on Amazon, no. If you really have a fire, it's not going to work out too well. And maybe a physical document will work, but if you have a drive inside the safe, if any smoke gets in, drive's ruined, and then you're back to doing forensics on a drive. So it depends on your risk model. It depends on what you're trying to prevent against. And this is why I struggled with is it's one thing if I just get hit by a bus, and that's the only thing we're considering, then that's a different model. But if you really want to take into account fire and all the other things we listed, it gets more and more difficult to truly do just an on-site model. Yeah. No, this was me testing my plan. So fortunately, I can laugh at this. Haha, my test completely failed. But fortunately, I didn't actually need it. I didn't have a bad day yet. But that's why we're talking about this now, is because hopefully we haven't had a bad day yet, and we can be more prepared for when that comes. So that was one way my plan failed. So I fixed that problem and manipulated so that wasn't a circular dependency anymore. But I made another change a few weeks later. I switched from LastPass to 1Password. And you might say, well, they're just password managers. Well, like, okay, sure, you change vendors. Well, the thing is that with LastPass, the default security model is that you have a username and a master password. That's how you get into your LastPass. You can do multi-factor, which I hadn't done because I was worried about locking myself out in case the multi-factor goes bad, and we'll talk about that later. But let's say we just have a username and master password. So when you switch to LastPass, it's a different security model. You need your username, you need your master password, but the first time you log into a device, you actually need an additional secret key. It's a long, random key, and it's a good part of the security model because if you're on a new device, like it's a little riskier, let's prove that it's really you. But where would I store those security keys? For me, that's in my encrypted file vault. So now, I can't even get into my password manager, so I can't even log in to my cloud backups. And so I surely don't have to worry about decrypting them because I can't even get to them in the first place. And all my files are lost for forever. And so for me, this is very upsetting because the thing is that if I was one of the people that said, oh, I don't do backups, and then something bad happened and I went, oh, I lost everything, you'd go, well, yeah, dummy, you weren't doing backups. But I was doing backups. And I was doing things like a password manager. And it still wasn't enough. And this is why I wanted to share that my misfortune, fortunately not that misfortune because it was just a test, I wanted to share that because I think other people, especially people that attend conferences like this, are more likely to put themselves in a bind with extra security controls and not realize it, because I wrote my whole plan and didn't realize it was going to fail until I actually tried it. So for me, a circular dependency was my problem. That's what broke my backup plan. But I'm worried about other things. So multifactor, and this is where it's really tricky because I don't want to spread fear about multifactor. But I want to talk about the risks it has and how we need to compensate for it. So if you're using SMS two-factor, which right now is all the rage to be like, that's terrible, so we're probably going to see things shift away from that maybe faster than we were expecting, you need to have your cell phone. Maybe you have an application doing a software token. If your cell phone is no longer around, what's the backup for it? If you have backup codes, then that helps get around if your multifactor is not working well. Where do I keep my backup codes? Encrypted file vault, so that doesn't help me. So I need to think about that. And then you have your hardware tokens. Well, the hardware tokens are great, and they have the best security that you can get out of multifactor, and I love that. And for work, I use them all the time. Great. But the problem is that we're not talking about work. We're talking about you. And with multifactor tokens, what happens if your primary one gets melted in a fire? Where's your secondary one? Okay, you have a secondary one. Is it offsite? Where is it kept offsite? Do people know where that offsite location is? So you run into all the same problems that you're dealing with backups is now something you have to deal with your multifactor. Now, when I was thinking about this, I was like, okay, let me see if there's an answer to this. And so I searched the vendor websites for what's your backup plan? What's your disaster recovery? And they say, okay, issue 2 tokens for your users just to be like really safe. You're going to have your primary and you're going to have your backup. But remember, the worst case is I just have to call the help desk. I am my help desk. If I get hit by a bus, the entire help desk is dead. So that's not very useful. And so it's something to think about when you're thinking about multifactor, is that a lot of times it's being pushed thinking enterprise and thinking about help desk. And you have to think about how it works for you and making sure you're covered and making sure that you have your primary and your backup works with all your accounts and you always can use it and it always works. So it's something to think about as we start seeing that adopted more and more places. You also have backup failure. This is where you're doing backups, but they really weren't backing up what you thought. Maybe it wasn't including all the directories you thought about. Maybe the backup hasn't run for 6 months and you didn't notice. That you can find stories of people that had personal backup software online. They go to recover it and their archive's been corrupted for 6 months and no one told them. So that's not very good. The backup didn't work. So that's something that we want to test for to make sure the backups actually work. And then we have existence failure. And this is really one of the harder parts of everything, because what this is talking about is if you have backups and they're automatic and they're offsite and they're awesome and you can always get into them and the person you care about has no idea they're even there, then they're worthless. And if they don't know what provider you're using, they're worthless. And if they don't know the username and password, then they're worthless. And they don't know how to use the software, then the backups are worthless. Yes, the backups are worthless, not the person you're thinking about. Sorry. But this is difficult because, again, we're not thinking just about ourselves. It'd be great if we always could do that. But we're thinking about what can other people in our lives do if we're no longer around. And then there's just inaction failure, which is if you don't have a plan, then trying to use the plan is not going to work. So how do we build a plan? So first, we're going to start off simple. Write the plan for you. And so what this means is you still want to document things. You want to start writing down your plan so that you make sure you have good coverage on all the things that matter to you. But the nice part is that when you run through it and test it, you get to be the one, it's in your mindset. So you know you best, and you know what software you're using and what all of your habits are. So this is relatively easy. But when you're testing it, it's still good to make sure you're not thinking of things in your head that if you need some special password or need to know where to go to, it's on your plan. And then we make it a little bit harder. We have to write the plan for someone else. So now you can't just say, oh, here's the password to my encrypted file volume. And that's all you need. For someone else, you need to say, I'm using this type of software. Let's say you're using VeraCrypt, and it's my drive decryption software, and here's the password. Okay, a little bit more detail. But then we go back to the problem of the spectrum of technological competency and realize that maybe the person you're thinking about struggles to use technology. And so you need to write a plan for someone that's less technical than you. And this is harder because now you have to say, all right, I use VeraCrypt, download it from this site. Once you go to your downloads folder, press install, yes, accept, yes, install. Okay, you've installed it. Now, here's what disk encryption software is. Here's how you mount a volume. And 4 pages later, you're ready to get them started and actually doing anything because they've never used anything like this. So this is more difficult. Now, we do have ways to mitigate this that we'll cover later. But it is important to think about. But there's more. At the very beginning, we talked about this. You want to think about the plan for someone else. What happens if they're gone and you're the one picking up the pieces? If you're lucky, your plan and their plan can be the same. If you're married, ta-da, that's a lot easier. But maybe that's not your situation, and so you have to think about, are you prepared to pick up the pieces? And this is more difficult because really at any time you can decide, yes, I want, like this sounds great, I'm going to start doing the planning and put the thought into it and execute it. But it's hard to convince someone else that it's worth it too. So what's in a plan? This is going to vary based on how old you are, if you're married, do you have kids, are you in retirement, are you far away from retirement? It's going to change what you're thinking about. But this is a loose framework of things that you can put in your plan. So passwords. What's really nice about passwords is that now the security recommendation has been pushing password managers. We can't remember lots of passwords. I have 340 accounts in my password manager, so I always laugh when I see some article talking about like, no one can remember 10 good passwords. I'm like, that's nowhere close. Add a zero and triple it, and that's what I have to deal with. So fortunately, from a security perspective, we can get a boost by using password managers. But we also get a disaster recovery boost because now we've consolidated. It is one of the risks of password managers, but at the same time, we've consolidated all this access into a place that we can delegate if we need to. So rather than your plan having to have 340 passwords that you have to remember and write down and test to make sure they even work, instead, you just give access to your password manager and you're good. Now at the bottom, I have 4 password managers. There's more out there. These 4 I've used. I switched recently from LastPass to 1Password. I'm very happy with 1Password, but remember the security model change. And so it's very important whenever you change this to rethink your disaster recovery plan. And it's also important to think about the security model and to test with whatever model you're using. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So that is one of the things you want to think about is continuity of bills and that type of thing. If you did get locked out, if the people know that you have 1Password and maybe it locks you out, I don't personally, I have not run into the situation, but I would assume that they would say, well, if you pay your bill, then we'll let you back in, and that sort of solves that problem. But it is something to think about, because especially if you are using a cloud service provider as opposed to just hosting it yourself. Yes?
I can possibly help with that solution. 1Password offers 2 options. Happens offers the cloud solution and the local solution. The local solution, the benefit of, is it never goes to the cloud, but also allows you to synchronize with your devices over a local Wi-Fi. So therefore, you both have access to not having that issue in which you have to pay them because it's a one-time cost, and allows you to synchronize with multiple wireless or portable devices. But also that hasn't been updated. No, it's consistent. It's still there. That hasn't changed. That model continues to be available and I've been using it for many years, and it continues.
Yeah, so there are multiple models with 1Password. If you want a purely offline model, KeyPass is what a lot of people use for that. You can synchronize that in Dropbox. You can do those types of things, but it is important to think about if you're taking more of that, technical debt essentially and managing it. Well, yes, it's nice to not have to necessarily trust a cloud service provider, but then you're, okay, what happens if you're like now you have to worry about your Dropbox, you have to worry about that being a critical asset for them to get in your password manager and all those types of things. So it is an issue. So we also want to think about backups. This is something that we've talked about already, but we want to make sure they're automatic and they're off-site. You get bonus points if you're doing it locally, and that will likely be faster in a lot of failure scenarios. If you just lost some files, it's a lot faster to copy it locally than to download it from someone else's cloud. But at the same time, that local drive, that maybe it's a second drive in your desktop, when your desktop dies or is stolen or is melted or floods, the same thing's going to happen to that drive. So there's a variety of providers. Backblaze is what I use. There's also Spider Oak, Carbonite. If you are a Crash Plan personal user, they have since retired their plan. Don't let them closing that down prevent you from having a backup. Make sure you take the time to switch. You may... What? For the personal to business? Okay. Yeah, so they do have the business option. It's just not tailored to personal use as much. But really, the point is that make sure you have one. File synchronization services like Dropbox, Box, OneDrive, those can count, but really only if you're honest with yourself. If you don't have everything synchronized or it doesn't have enough space, you have to pick and choose your files. That's not really good enough. They're not really meant for Emacs backup. So while you can kind of kludge it and make it work, it is good to just accept that you need a backup provider. What's nice is that they've made this commodity. Backblaze is $5 a device a month. That's a price I'm willing to pay to just not deal with the problem. I could make some Amazon EC2 instance and do some rsync stuff like I used to do when I had a lot more free time. But at the same time, if that stops running, I might not notice for 3 weeks, and that could be a problem. You also want to put your financials in the plan. What's nice about this is that this is relatively simple because this is helping solve an existence problem. All you need to do is just write down a lot of these plans, and that will be very useful to someone else, just to know that they exist. So your bank accounts, checking and savings, your investment accounts, any retirement accounts, cryptocurrency, that's where you're going to need more detail because of the complexity and the fact that it's purely digital. And then anything you have like bills, credit cards, loans, mortgages, all those sorts of things. But really, this is not going to take you very long. It's a table that says what the account is, who it's with, who the point of contact is if you're used to dealing with someone, or if you have a brick and mortar place you go to, where that is. Those are the types of things that take you 60 seconds and save someone weeks of struggle when you're no longer around. You also have to deal with credit bureaus and the government. If you're in the US, we have a lovely credit system. The big ones are Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian, but you also have the fourth one that most people don't know about called Innovis. If you freeze your credit, like you should, and as of September 1st, it is free to freeze and unfreeze your credit with the big four. Yay, the Senate passed that, so that's really nice. But you also have NICTUI. Yes, they did a good thing. So now that's free. It's a really good recommendation to stop identity theft. My social security and all of my personal information is out, like it's been leaked, I don't know, every day of the week. So I just assume that everyone has it, that you can Google for it. So I lock my identity down, and I lock down my wife and my family's down. But if I'm no longer around, they need a way to actually unfreeze that and to manage their credit again. Otherwise, they're going to have difficulty with their finances. If you haven't heard of NICTUI, that's a more recent public-facing one. It's through the telecommunications provider. Brian Krebs reported on it more recently. That's something else you could be freezing, but then also have to worry about making sure you can thaw it. From the government side, you have Social Security Administration, and even if you're far away from needing retirement, it's actually generally good practice. Again, Brian Krebs reporting for Social Security to create a Social Security account so that way identity thief can't steal your identity with the government or with the IRS. So these are things we might do, but we want to make sure that if we're no longer around, that we can pass off this to the people we care about. And then for taxes, you also might just have your tax filings, and you want to make it a little bit easier when April comes around. So it's things to think about. Maybe you didn't get hit by the bus hard enough, and so you want to use your insurance. That would be great. This might be as simple as just looking in your wallet, but depending on the scenario, that might not be accessible. It takes 10 seconds. Write down what your health insurance is, because we need to make sure that you don't get like $10 million in hotel bills and hospital bills. It's not that nice. To make sure that your health is taken care of. Or maybe the bus was going just fast enough and you need the life insurance policy. If it's something through your employer, this might be easier for you to find out about, for your family to find out about. But if you have separate policies, it might be something you need to document so people know about it. Yes?
Two things. Two things. One, you also have to think about a will. or trust. And two, you don't want to have only a life insurance policy through your employer, because if you get hit hard enough by the bus that you're in the hospital and the employer releases you and then you die, you don't have life insurance anymore.
Yep. And we'll get to the will part in a little bit.
Okay, fine.
But right, so regardless of what policies you do have, it's important for disaster recovery purposes to know what you do have in the first place. And then we have a catch-all for your home and your home information technology. So as we start getting smart things and we start having more complex networks, if you're like me, I have a really complex network for absolutely no good reason. I have like 5 VLANs and just it's ridiculous, but I'm my own NOC. And so if I go down, then the network might start going down. And so those are things I have to put in my plan. But really, this is a catch-all for how do you keep your house running? Maybe in 2018, it's as simple as like pay the water bill and that's about it. But in 2030, how do you keep your house running? And what's it going to look like in 2050? And so as we start adding these things in, your plan needs to change accordingly. And then we're going to just talk about general technology and security. So maybe you're doing something that's different than what an average person would expect. Maybe you are using the multifactor. Well, that's great, but can the other people in your life use the multifactor to get into your accounts? So if maybe you have a primary and a backup key, great, but where's the backup key? How do they use it? How do they use that to get into your life? And so that's more difficult. Now, something that I put in my plan that I found extraordinarily useful is to have points of contact. And this is how you simplify a lot of the really hard technical problems. So rather than write a 5-page essay to my wife or to my parents about cryptocurrency and what private keys are and what exchanges are and just talk ad nauseum about blockchain, instead I can cut that all short and say, I have cryptocurrency, here's the bare minimum details you need, and here's my buddy Tyler. My buddy Tyler, he knows everything you could possibly need about it, and I trust him, and he will help you. So on a bad day, you call my buddy Tyler, and instead of having to write 5 pages, I wrote 1 sentence, and I actually have a lot more assurance that anything will actually go right because he can just figure it out. He'll just know because that's my buddy Tyler. Whereas my parents would, even with good instructions, would not get into my cryptocurrency. So that's how I saw that problem. And so this is something, as you talk about, and as you think about your plan, I would also encourage you to reach out, find points of contact for yourself, but also think about who you could be a point of contact for. So on a bad day, people in your life can count on you to help them out. All right, so bonus. So we're getting really grim. We're talking about all your digital life and everything's falling apart and everything's very sad. So what else can we think about? Well, a lot of these disasters are not exclusive to your digital life or to your laptop or your desktop. They really involve your physical life too. And so if there's floods or hurricanes or other things you might be dealing with, you should also think about a physical kit. Now, I'm not an expert on this. I'm not saying you need to be a prepper. If you want to build a bunker in your backyard, that's awesome. You don't necessarily need to do that. But you should also think about, okay, what do I want to take with me? Backup batteries. Those are really awesome for just having more cell service than anyone else. But then first aid, water, non-perishable food, those types of things. You can escalate into how much you want to have. I think Costco will sell you a 365-day supply of canned goods. It's like $1,000. It's a great deal if you want 365 days of cans. But you don't necessarily need it. Now, think about analog will, so not digital life. There's a couple components of it. Depends on your life. You can start thinking about things like a trust and add more complexity. But it really comes down to who's going to carry out the will, who gets your stuff, how is your stuff split up, and if you have kids, who's going to be the guardians for it. So this isn't something I'm certainly not an attorney or an expert on, but it's something that you can be thinking about. If you're thinking about all of your digital life, you can take a few steps to think about the physical, runaway kit or your analog will as well. So we've talked about the plan and why you want the plan and what should go in the plan and how your plan is going to be awesome. But there's some complexities we need to address, and unfortunately, this has actually been the hardest part for me. So updating your plan. Okay, when do we update it? Well, when you write your plan, that counts as update. Points for you. And then every 12 months, 6 months is a good interval. But really, the answer is that you should update it whenever anything changes. So if you change providers, if something's changing in your life, new accounts, removing accounts, those types of things, it warrants an update of your plan. And whenever you change that plan, you should test it because, like myself, it wasn't until testing that I found out my problems. And the small changes, just, oh, I changed my password provider, not a big deal, caused me problems. And so only testing it will show that. Now, how do you test it? So for the more technical side, the easiest way to test it is essentially just spin up a Linux live CD. You can either do this with the actual computer, or you can do it even easier with VirtualBox, VMware, some sort of virtualization software. If you start up a Linux live CD, haha, you have a brand new computer. If you can get into what you care about in that Linux live CD, then you're good. You have to use the plan. You can't use it from memory because that's cheating. You have to use the plan, but if you can get to things, then you're good. In my case, I used my plan, and that wasn't good enough. My plan failed. I had to go outside my Linux live CD, my virtual instance of it, to actually run my plan to ground. And so that wasn't good enough. And so that let me iterate and figure out, okay, how do I adjust it? How do I make my plan better? How do I make it better for myself? So that it actually works. And then I tested it again, and actually, now it works. Cool. But you also want to think about testing your plan with the people you're thinking about, because it's really easy for us to overlook things and to just use something that's in your head that you don't realize is actually important detail. So it's good to run it through with the people you're thinking about in the first place, because one, they'll tell you when you've overlooked something, and two, it gives them a lot better chance that they'll succeed because they'll have seen it before if they ever need it. And that comes to storing the plan. So what I've just asked you to do is I want you to write down all the important details to take over your entire digital life so that someone else can do it when you're not around, and then put that somewhere. And that's a really hard problem. In my case, I've accepted the risk, and the way I do it is I have 2 physical copies. So I have my digital copy is just the framework. I fill out the important details. I print 2 copies. I have one in a fire safe, but I don't think that's good enough because what happens if my house just completely burns down, and now it's just ash. And I have one at my parents' house. Okay, so why can I do that? 2 reasons. One, my parents are far enough away that the same disaster is probably not going to hit both of us at the exact same time, but they're close enough that I actually have to have a chance of updating it regularly, and I don't have to get on a plane to do so. And 2, because I trust my parents to not use the plan against me. Not everyone has the luxury of those 2 assumptions. So this is just something that works for me, and it's not something that works for everyone. I thought about safety deposit boxes, but that doesn't always work because safety deposit boxes, that's something that bank is controlling. You have access to it. You can have other people have access to it. That might help if let's say you're thinking about a spouse. You can just make sure they have access to it. That's good enough for them. But let's think if you're thinking about someone further away, maybe you don't want them to have access all the time. And then that means if you die, okay, it's going to fall back to your traditional will or to beneficiaries. And there's going to be a time that passes before they can get into a safety deposit box. And so that's not necessarily going to be the fastest thing that you might want for your digital will, essentially. There's other things to think about, like a dead man switch. The problem with that is how do you give them your plan and make sure that it's not some digital service you just handed all of your secrets over to? How do they actually distribute that in some sort of unencrypted form that people can get to without a lot of a priori building encryption, all those sorts of things? So that's not necessarily acceptable. So this takes some finesse. It depends on where you live, depends on other people you have access to. If you have ability to store this in a good fire safe and something like that, that might be acceptable to you. But it's something to think about. If you just went to all this effort of building this disaster recovery plan and testing it, make sure that the plan itself is accessible and make sure the people that you care about know about it, because the existence problem applies not only to the backups and all the things that are in the plan, the existence problem applies to the plan itself. So don't spend all this time and then have it be completely forgotten about. So for some people, when I was doing trial runs, they were like, wow, this is just like insanely overwhelming. I have no idea what to do with any of this. And so my message to the people thinking that is just try something. You don't have to go home or do this tonight and have a full plan that's tested by tomorrow morning. That'd be awesome if you did. But you don't need to do that. If one person in this room does anything at all to get slightly better posture to deal with any sort of disaster, I consider that a win. So just try and do something. Start on the path. If you're not using a password manager, you're not doing any sort of backups, then just start towards that. Fix that problem, and then think about the bigger problem of all the existence problems and storing it and all those things. So at least get started so you can handle some sorts of disaster. So to summarize, offsite backups that are automatic, a password manager to consolidate, and just have good security practice. documenting it so anyone else can actually follow it, and then actually doing any of this is pretty important too. And then when you've done all that, you need to test it to make sure it actually works. Because the reason we're doing all this is because we were thinking of someone at the beginning. We were thinking of ourselves or someone else we care about, and that's the motivation we need to do this. So that's all I have. I'm happy to take more questions. I'll stick around a little bit afterwards if you have some.
Sure. Why did you switch from LastPass? What was it about LastPass that made you want to change?
I'll just play Jerry Springer here and do this.
So for me, it was less about the security or the backup or redundancy or anything like that. I just found LastPass was a little bit more difficult to use intuitively, and there were really it was just like quirkiness where just 95% of the time it worked right, and then other 5% of the time it just didn't sync or something didn't end up the way I liked it. So I tried 1Password out as basically a trial basis and liked that. And what I also really like about 1Password is they publish a very thorough security model. And with any password manager, you have the struggle of, well, how good are they actually doing unless you audit their entire binaries because most of them are closed source. How do I know that they're not just funneling everything off? But I like their security model. It shows that they're thinking about it in a thorough way. They're thinking about the attack surface. They're not just going completely overkill on every security problem you could think of, but they're doing what they can that's reasonable. So I found that it was a good balance between security and utility. That's why I liked it. Anyone else?
All right.
Okay.
Gentleman from Atlanta.
So you briefly mentioned the use of safety deposit boxes as a place to store your digital life, in a sense. So, and you said that you didn't think they were generally the most optimal idea because of the potential lag between when somebody who needs to get in that you have previously told the bank to allow access to have access to. But could you not tell the bank to give the executor of your will access, like when you sign up for your safety deposit box, and then when you're dead and they're coming in to clean up your life, they can just get into it that way?
So you potentially could. It's more likely like that you're going to have a death certificate along with the will, and that's going to be how you can go around and go to banks and do this. In the experience with my grandparents, you can go to some banks, Bank of America, and the paperwork is just different every time you go in, and so it takes some time to just get it right. So it's not always straightforward. There's going to be a time delay. Eventually it might work out. It's just how much time are you willing to accept? Let's say in your case, you were talking about the bills and the cloud payment and all that type of thing. What happens if for 14 days you can't get into any of that? Is that acceptable to you? So you could do a safety deposit box in addition to other things to help mitigate that risk and just kind of have options. But at this point, I don't want to rely on that. It also requires money. They could. If there's the people you're thinking about, you're willing to give them access to it basically all the time. So like for me, if I set it up and just let my wife have access, that's acceptable to me. But what happens if my wife and I are driving along and we're both killed in a car crash? This entire topic depends on what your paranoid and risk level, and those are the same thing depending on how realistic you are. It depends on what your level is. So I'm not assuming that myself and my wife and my parents and my brother, I'm not assuming they're all going to get hit in the same car crash. But at the same time, my wife and I spend a lot of time together. We travel together, and so maybe the risk of us actually both not being available is higher than I'm willing to accept. Yep.
Yeah, for YouTube. Always for YouTube.
First of all, thanks for laying out some of these things that you went through. I haven't done the plan. You know, you motivated me to look at that. My general statement is based upon a little bit like when it came to when my dad passed away. For every account that there is joint ownership of, we could get all the money out fast, but my mother accidentally leaked to one particular bank that my father had died, and they were like, okay, we're shutting off access. Nobody can get to it until probate. So there's a certain amount of, if you don't say shit, you can close stuff down and your life is a whole lot easier than if you say shit. The second thing is I've also gone through the statement of limiting how much was my digital life versus my analog life. So there's a number of bank accounts where I have purposely said, no, send me a paper statement. I don't have login access to it because the vulnerability, my threat model says, I'm more likely to have Google lock me out of my account than anything else. And so therefore, don't have all these things going, becoming digital, make them all analog. So that would be my suggestion, is say, before you say everything you have to protect, is think about what you can simplify.
Sure. Yep, you can always try and simplify things, keep some analog traces. Those are useful. The thing that jumps to mind is then a registration attack, which just totally depends on the bank that you have. Because what if to make a new account or to register your online account just requires the last 4 of your social and your billing zip code, which everyone knows about me because you can just like Google it probably. So it depends on whether you're willing to accept that. And that sort of comes back to the Social Security account, where you might not make the account because you need it right now, but you make the account because you don't want someone else to create it. So I kind of struggle with if you stay away from digital, then someone else might move you digital whether you like it or not. But I think it's a good concept to keep in mind of like what can you still keep physical to make it easier on yourself. Okay. Well, that's the end of my time. So I hope you have a good closing ceremony. Stay safe. Watch out for those buses, and the cabs will take you out. So watch out too.